Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nicolas Massaviol, as he just said. I'm a co-founder of Toucan System and a security enthusiast. I'm a third French guy today, so you probably end up having some weird accent at the end of the day. Don't worry, it will pass. So I'm here to talk about cars, so that's the second talk about cars today. There will probably be some of the stuff we already saw this morning. I'm going to go quickly over it. So it's about the self-driving cars and the not-so-autonomous security, because as we will see, security is not automatic when we deal with cars. So what's the agenda today? See that here, agenda. So the first thing is I'm going to go through a quick recap about what's a modern car nowadays, what we are expecting to see, not from the material mechanical point of view, but from the electronic point of view, which is interesting for us for hacking. Next, we'll go through how we can find some vulnerabilities, how we tried and managed to find some of those vulnerabilities, because we're working on cars for about 3 or 4 years now, with at least 2 major manufacturers. We will also go through how not to find some vulnerabilities, because to be honest, we plan on having a new ECU from one manufacturer that we didn't research before, and have some new things to present to this talk. But actually we made a lot of mistakes, and this is part of the failures, and we will try to explain why we went through these failures, so you guys can not do the same errors again. The next topic would be finding backdoors. We saw this morning a little bit about some of the legal backdoors that are included in the ECUs. We will go through all of them that I can think of. And last thing will be on the autonomous driving and the autonomous vehicle in itself. What are the future challenges, and what are we going to face in the next couple of years? So what's a modern car nowadays? So from an electronic point of view, it's a graph or network made from nodes. There are ECUs. So ECUs stands for electronic control units, and they're connected with a CAN bus. They're also connected to all sensors or actors through various different physical interface. So it can be 3G, 2G for external communications, VDS for screen, can be linear to have some access to sensors. Usually they are multiplexed. But basically it's the idea is they have a network topology of ECUs, and nowadays cars usually end up with about 30 different ECUs, which are complete black boxes. So one ECU can be compared to an embedded device. It's completely an embedded device. So you have 30 different ways of approaching an embedded device for one car. And the typical network topology is not driven by security. Now, the cars today were designed at least 4 or 5 years ago, and there was no security at all. So all the network topology that we see today, they are not driven by security. So you typically end up with this. So it's a complete mess, and it's driven by functions and features. For example, the multimedia, if it needs to have access to the vehicle speed to display the vehicle speed on the multimedia, okay, we just connect this to the CAN bus where the vehicle speed is produced. So that's typically the engine, for example, or the wheels. And it's the same for everything. So it's driven by feature, not security. And we end up with architectures such as the Jeep, which in the case of 2015, Charlie Miller and Chris Velasek demonstrated that compromising the multimedia, we could just send random messages on the CAN bus that would be directly interpreted by the brakes and the engine. So directly compromise this. There's also the OBD port. So this one is a special interest because, as we see earlier, it's the typical way for dealers to request and make some special privilege actions on the ECUs. The OBD port is just that. It's a port. There's no ECU, there's no electronic. It's only wires directly to the internal CAN of the vehicles. So that's one of the architecture. We may stumble upon a second one that is a little bit better. We have a central gateway that is responsible for dispatching messages between the CAN buses. So usually it's a better design because inside the gateway you already have some kind of firewalls because the messages would only be routed if there are known. Unknown messages are not routed, and especially if you happen to send some breaking message on the multimedia bus that is on the upper side, it won't get routed to the engine or the brakes. So this is a better design, but once again, it wasn't designed with the security in mind. So you might end up with some additional ECUs, such as on the right here, which bypasses completely the gateway. So it makes a bridge between two buses because, hey, some feature need that. So typically, these kind of architectures are they are everywhere on every car nowadays. Interestingly, the Tesla that was supposed to have this kind of architecture with a gateway, central gateway, yesterday got hacked. So some Chinese subsidiary of Tencent, they published exploit demonstration on the exploit of a multimedia system, and they were able to send brake commands and other kind of privilege requests to the brakes and the engine. So it was supposed to be also the gateway-like, but then compromising the multimedia just gave access to the whole canvas. So we don't have a technical report yet, so I'm not sure which of the different architecture they are using, but if they use this topology, they would have to pivot inside the vehicle and to compromise the gateway also. So, a little bit about the CAN bus, just a quick reminder. So what's the CAN bus? It's used to transport messages. The messages are roughly like that. You have a starter frame, an ID that can be 11 or 29 bits, the length, the data, it could be 0 to 64 bits, the CRC, and an end of frame. So it's designed for transporting messages in a trusted environment, and it does this it does a very decent job at this. It was never intended to be used in a hostile environment. So it was designed like this. And one thing to remember that IDs are not addresses. One ECU may have many IDs. It can produce many different messages with different IDs. You can read many different IDs also, so those are not addresses. Also, the data that it contains are usually bit fields, so it doesn't really make any sense to talk about bytes here. It's really bit fields. For example, the engine frame with the ID 1A9 may have 3 bits for the engine state, on, off. Does it have the key on or key off? 8 bits for the rounds per minute, and 5 bits that are reserved for later use, for example. And this whole design is completely proprietary, it's opaque. It changes between OEMs, it changes between make and model of the same OEMs. So once you have done the work of reversing the whole message set that is on some kind of one car, then you cannot port this to another car. You have to do the work all over again. So that's where some nice tools come in, like CAN Badger, for example. And I'm pretty sure that no one has done any study at the physical level. So some hobbits may appear And packet in packet, I'm pretty sure, 99% sure that this will work on the canvas. But there's no tools available to do this. So what are we interested in is not all ECUs, because 30 embedded device to audit is a bit too much. So we are mainly interested in two kinds of ECUs: the highly exposed one, such as the multimedia system, the telematic units, the V2X, so that's the vehicle-to-vehicle communication unit, or the vehicle-to-infrastructure unit, and the highly privileged ones, so the ones that are able to make the car accelerate, brake, or steer. That would be the engine, the brakes, obviously, and more recently the ADAS system. ADAS, it stands for Advanced Driver Assistance System. We will talk about it in the autonomous driving. It's the one that is responsible for the intelligence of the autonomous driving. The ESP to correct the trajectory, so all those kinds of ECUs are interesting for us to attack. So now that we have the targets, how do we find vulnerabilities? So actually it's pretty standard from the hardware point of view, and it's pretty easy. So you go for the debug interfaces, first thing, because usually they're open and they're here. So the first one, not complicated at all, the serial console, UARTs. Usually you found those everywhere. You have 4 pins here, so that's classic hint that there's something going on. And you usually end up with some kind of menus or outputs. Even if you don't have interactive shell, you at least have some logs or sensitive information that got printed on the serial console here. So that's the first thing you go for. You usually have them, unless some people like us told the car makers, you shouldn't do this. And even if they paid attention to this, usually you still find some of them. So that's the first one, really classic. Second one, we already talked about it this morning, JTAG access. So that's another kind of debug interface. Depends heavily on the supplier's awareness, if it's present or not. It's usually open. We haven't found in the first place when we attacked one ECU, we never saw a closed one right from the start. Sometimes it's protected by password, and it's near impossible to have it locked completely due to shared responsibilities in case of malfunctions. What you have to understand is that when the supplier is responsible for supplying ECU, then when the ECU is malfunctioning, it returns from the field, so the car maker takes it out for analyzing. And the analysis in itself uses those JTAG ports. And if the supplier is not able to analyze this, then it's not his responsibility. So the car maker has to pay. So that's a question of who's paying what. And when money is in question, then security usually suffers. So it's really, really hard to get this properly done. So removing JTAG completely is near impossible. Usually we can have some kind of password access. Hopefully not the same password for all units, but it's different difficulty here. Next thing is to attack the memories. So to get the firmware, the code, to be able to reverse it and analyze this. So classical methods here. I'm not going to teach anyone everything. The EEPROMs, really easy to dump. With in circuit, you don't have to solder it out. More difficult, the NAND and NOR flashes. You usually have to solder it out and make some external tools to go and read it. And also the eMMCs, which are the easiest one. They have embedded microcontrollers, so you can reliably read and write to them using, for example, the standard SD card reader. You just connect the right pins, so you still have to have the pin out, but the usually standard. So eMMCs are really cool. And this the data on those memories are never encrypted. Just never happens. Embedded devices, so the supplier's answer is, oh, too costly to implement this, and it will cost a penalty of 20% in performance, so no, we won't implement it. Next thing you go for is the update files. So this is one really interesting way of obtaining the firmware and the code to find some vulnerability. Usually they're not in plain text, so you still have to do some transformations to get to the actual firmware, but it's some kind of encryption, so encryption. We only saw one implementation using proper cryptography, with the key properly stored in the targets. So the key was encrypted using the target's unique device key, and this was hard to break, but not impossible. Other use cases, they all use some kind of weak obfuscations, like file system splits. You have 10 files that you have to place in the correct order, and file system. And short passwords on zip files, any kind of proprietary obfuscation technique here. And there's one, you usually can get them on the website of the manufacturer for the multimedia systems, because they are huge files, so they usually want the user to update these. For the multimedia system, very easy to get the firmware. Or if not, if you're going for an ECU inside the car, you can go to the European servers, which stores all the update files. They are mandatory to publish those for independent dealers. So you can get the files directly on those servers. Or you can use CAN Badger to capture it on the CAN, but you still have to have some legitimate tools to flash the ECU. So it's not really practical, but at least you can go on the servers and get the code. So once you have the code, there's two possibilities. Either the classic reverse engineering, which you all know. If it's ARM-based and embedded Linux, so they are usually the multimedia system and the telecom TCU, the telecommunication unit. It's very similar to smartphones. It's a classical Unix, so nothing new here. And there's also a not so classic reverse engineering. So this one will be a very lengthy process. You usually have a huge variety of microcontrollers inside each of those ECUs, and they're very exotic, very particular. Sometimes they're specially designed for automotive industry, and you never encounter them other than in these places. So you have the V850, many versions, ES1, 2, RH. You have the 78K0, MPC5X, DSPIC, whatever. There's a lot of different architecture. And of course, very few tools, very few documentations. The chip maker usually don't publish this very easily. And they also are very old. So the V850 version 2, for example, 2003, if I remember correctly, and it's only beginning to appear in modern ECUs. So the very first step is having a clean disassembly, and then you can hope to reverse something. But this is a very lengthy process. But once you have this, then you can have some very interesting things. Example, this was found on the Telematics units. So you were looking for what version of OpenSSL is this ECU using, for example. So you grep OpenSSL, and then you stumble upon this string to make the random generator think it has entropy. Yay! That's the initialization vector, so good. So we have some, the gap between what we saw in the previous presentation of LoRaWAN, for example, and the implementation of cryptography inside those ECUs are huge. I mean, it's completely crazy here. That's also, the telematic units, they also are built usually around Sierra Wireless modems. They are SL678s. And they use the OpenAT operating system. And this is what, in 2015, they embed the OpenSSL release 101C, which is up to date, right? Very nice OpenSSL version. And it's not even in the current ECUs, because the current ECUs do not embed this version of OpenAT. So let's switch to how not to find vulnerabilities now. Because we happen to get Volkswagen ECUs for use of these presentations. We say, okay, we are going to reproduce what we do for our clients, but for someone that has nothing to do with us, so we can publish. But we did everything wrong here. So we end up burning the units and learn nothing. So what steps not to make to be able to find some vulnerabilities? Well, the first one is have multiple identical parts. This is very important because you will probably end up breaking one or two, and if you only have one, then it's game over. So when you're doing this, either you have a recovery plan or you will probably fail. So breaking ECU is very likely, so I have a few of them here. You can have a look after the presentation if you want to. There are all Volkswagen ECUs. If you are going to blindly fuzz the CAN, it may result in some serious injuries if you're driving the car. This is what happened to a Jeep, for example. And blindly fuzzing the diagnostic service will most probably destroy the ECU. That's for the CAN badger that we saw earlier. If you fuzz blindly, you're 100% sure to destroy the ECU. They have some functions and routines that erase the whole memory, for example. So if you do this blindly, you will fail. So that happened to us also. What looks like the same connector. So that's the Volkswagen one. We have a Golf 7 GTE multimedia, and we plugged it into a normal Golf 7. And it happens that the multimedia system are not the same version. So we plugged it in, poof, smokes everywhere. Nothing works. And then we go, oh, okay, we cannot do any dynamic analysis, so we are going to dump the flash. So we desolder the flash, and nothing works. So even reading the eMMC that I talked about earlier, this didn't work. So what looks like an eMMC may not be readable with standard tools, for example. And what looks like a SATA interface, because we saw some hard disks in BMW, for example, and the SATA disk here is a regular SATA interface, but it will not respond to standard SCSI commands. So not readable with standard tools. They implemented their own firmware to, I don't know, to be able to meet some special features of the car. So this is not readable right away. Also, some diagnostic functions that the CAN badger guys told us about, they depend on the vehicle states, and especially if there are several wake-up status of the ECUs. If the engine is on, if the vehicle is running, if it has a vehicle speed different than 0, they all have different states that can influence the diagnostic functions. And you end up having very weird results if you don't really care about this. JTAG is not so standard. Joe Fitzpatrick, he told us about JTAG and say, oh, very easy. Yes, ARM devices, it works really, really well. For all the other microcontrollers, you usually end up having to order the manufacturer for the correct probes. for the proprietary probes and special IDEs that go with it, and reversing the JTAG, or at least record and replay, to be able to interact with the JTAG. And so you will most probably end up with a nice collection of JTAG probes, and then those are very expensive. And like I said, you have a whole range of different microcontrollers, and you each have their own JTAG probes. So, and it's a lengthy process. When you order one, you may have to wait for 1-2 months to get one. So, IDE suites that work with the JTAG, for example, they are competing for the least usable software ever designed. So, it's very, very difficult to work with those tools. It's a huge mess. Reversing architecture unsupported by IDA, so that's also the case for some of the microcontrollers, will waste more time than you initially expected, so it's time consuming. The CAN is very slow, so you might want to consider this when you are doing some brute forcing attack. And also the read and writing may be unreliable, so you don't expect to have correctly written your NAND flash at the first try. So all those are ways to waste time and destroy the ECU that you're trying to hack into. Let's go to finding backdoors now. So, backdoors, they come in various forms. We've seen a lot of them, and they usually are present on all different ECUs, especially the multimedia system. Hidden menus, the special tap sequence. You go into the photo settings, tap once on the upper left, twice on the lower right, and developer menu, you have some special debugging tools, very privileged functions that are accessible, etc. So that's not a one we encounter, but it's the Konami code, very popular, very famous. You can also have some stealth crafted file on a SD card. So it's not the .backdoor, but it's .developer menu, for example. You stick it into the multimedia system, poof, super developer menu that you can use. And other in-vehicle sequences. So maybe they're not related to the multimedia, but for example, Volkswagen and the Dieselgate that we heard in the news, when it was detecting that the trunk was open, the rear right wheel was blocked, and the battery was charging. All those indicated that it was in a special testing mode, and then it output a special result. So those are all in the hidden menu category here. And they're all discoverable by reversing the firmware. Hidden features, a little bit the same here. We happen to see some implementations that, okay, you plug in a USB device with a special VID PID, and you get a SSH shell without password that you can use directly. They open up a network interface on the USB. Very practical. So those are, usually they are developed during the development phase at the supplier. Maybe the car maker is not even responsible or doesn't know about them, but it's in the production units, and it's all over the multimedia system, for example. You may have some hardware jumpers or pull-ups that will end up booting a special image with a diagnostic interface that you can use to read and write directly to memory. We saw that in the field. Or, even better, direct ADB on a USB port inside the unit. There's a special USB that is not routed. What's this? You plug it in. Oh, ADB. Perfect. So, other kinds of backdoors. We talked about some diagnostic and UDS previously with the CAN badger, so I'm going to go quickly over this. The diagnostic is especially UDS in the most recent ECUs, as we already seen. So you have different sets of services, you have changing sessions, managing sessions, reset, read and write parameters, so that's just configurations. read and write memory by address, which is really interesting, like we already saw. And there's also some kind of authentication with JOX27, the security access. You guys of Can Badger also talk about this. What they didn't dive into is that the security access, they usually special crypto, custom crypto, special crypto. So it's just a series of XOR and shifts, and that's called crypto. And usually they have one ECU type, one key. So they all share the same key. And guess what? The key is asymmetric. It's 16 bits. So very, very interesting. So the security access there's no real security here. And even in specifications, so that's the ISO standard. This is what they are putting as an example. Seed of the server, for example, and say, okay, key of the server, 2 bytes, seed, 2 bytes. It's a challenge response, and then you encrypt the seed with the key, and you feed this back to the ECUs to authenticate. Real crypto. In the UDS, you also have other kinds of backdoors. The service 31 is routines. They call it routines in the UDS. It's functions in reality. So the calling convention is standard, but they are all different. They are special to the ECU, special to the OEMs, and they are defined by whoever wants to implement them. So the car makers are defining a set of routines, but then nothing prevents the supplier from including other ones. If they're not used by the car maker, okay, I can use some others to, I don't know, to make some validations. So what happens is that, for example, I'll go back a little bit, the read and write memory by address, which is obviously a bad thing from a security point of view, just reads the memory directly and write to memory. They used to protect it behind security access. Now they forbid it completely. So they disable the service 23 and 3D. But then the supplier, he needs it. Maybe he needs it for his development process. So what's he going to do? Well, implement special routines that is just read and write by address. So you have a beautiful backdoor. The car maker doesn't know about it. It's only used by the supplier. It's just the calling convention is standard. You just use it and dump the firmware. There's also I/O controls 2F. That's another service, which is really, really interesting because it does some actions on the ECU. It influences the output, the functions of the ECU itself. So it can control the headlights, for example. So if you're on the highway at night, turn off the headlight, for example, very interesting. Funny things happen. You can blow the airbag. It's one UDS service. Anytime. Interesting. And trigger some specific actions. So it all depends on the ECU, what the supplier and the car makers have implemented as I/O controls. And they may not be aware of all the I/O controls that were put into the ECU. Other kinds of backdoors. This is a text that was taken from the Brazil regulations. It's a resolution taken in 2007. It states that all vehicles should be sold with anti-theft mechanism. So to be able to track and disable vehicles remotely. So it's working at the GSM level. No real authentication on GSM, everybody knows. And at the application level, well, nothing is planned for authentication either. So that's the kind of service that they are designing to implement in the telematic units. Sending an SMS, the car won't work anymore. No authentication planned. What about denial of service here? Very bad. So what happens is that the software for the Brazilian units, they're exactly the same as the ones that are sold in the US or the Europe. Exactly the same. The only configuration changes. So I activate, enable or disable the service, and this gets implemented. So as we saw, configuration changes, they are maybe protected by security access. Oh, security access not so secure. What happens? Maybe I can send some SMS and prevent your car from working. This can be distributed. All cars in a given area are disabled, for example. Could be interesting. And also the EU is working on similar features. Maybe they will implement some kind of authentication for their service, but the Brazilian one, there's no authentication. Another one that is completely unofficial right now, the remote viewing. They want to, all cars now are equipped with some cameras. So, and the autonomous driving that we'll talk about, they all have a lot of optical sensors, cameras. So that's a real dream come true for surveillance business. And the law enforcement and agencies, they are investigating this. What use can we do with all these moving cameras on the road? Maybe we can implement some recognition on this. It's also the remote sound capture here. This one is already implemented, already in the high-end cars, and will become mandatory. So the sound capture, you have emergency calls that when the crash is detected, it calls automatically the the rescue or doctor, fireworks, and it relays the sound to know what happens in the car. And this capability, how secure is this capability? How much do you trust them to implement this securely? What would it take to program a different phone number inside the telematic units to call, I don't know, someone else, then just listen to what happens in the car? Okay, let's switch to the autonomous vehicle now. And the future challenge. So the autonomous vehicles, what do we exactly mean by the autonomous vehicle? So there's at least 4 or 5 levels defined. The level 1 is the driver assistance. It's already implemented, already in the field, 2015. So they are just lane assist, collision avoidance. So all those systems, they are driver assistance. That's level 1. Level 2 is partial automations. The driver attention is required at all time. So you have to have the hands on the wheels and be able to take control of the vehicle at any time. So that's planned for 2018. Tesla is already there, so they're a bit in advance on this global planning. Level 3 is conditional automations. It's planned for 2020, and this is what, in the marketing terms, we call the autonomous vehicle. The driver attention is not required in some conditions. So when the conditions are met, for example, on the highway, there's sun with good visibility, then the driver can take his hands off the wheel and do something else. No driver attention required. Level 4 or 5, which is complete or full automations, is planned for 2025. So level 4 is no attention required at all, no conditions. Level 5 is take out the manual controls away, so no wheels and pedals. This is what the car makers are thinking when they are talking about the autonomous vehicle, and usually it's level 3. So what we have to understand here is the development cycles of those vehicles. 2020, well, the definitions, the technical definitions, is already frozen. The research has, well, we will build the autonomous vehicles for 2020 with today's technology. This is the roughly theory about the development process. So the research, when they decide to launch a new car, design a new car, they freeze the research at this point in time. So they take all the technologies that are available, they put it into the car, and the development phase begins. So the development phase is just the theory of making all those technologies work together. It lasts about a year, and next the industrialization phase begins, which is just testing, validating that everything works correctly according to a theory of the development. And that one lasts about a year and a half. That's the theory. So it's about at least 2.5 years frozen in time. So 2020, it's about right now. So they are making the autonomous vehicle with today's technology, and especially with their knowledge of the security of today. So the security of today will be implemented into the autonomous car. So when we understand where they are currently at the state of the art for vehicle security, then we may have a problem here. So the autonomous vehicles, they will be connected. It's necessary to make the autonomous vehicle. It's necessary to be connected. So there's many functions that will be required to make it autonomous. The remote updates, OTA updates, the remote navigations. You also have the remote actions, lock and lock, the start engine, remote valet, where you expect your autonomous vehicle to go park itself, and then you call it back, so you expect it to come back. Remote actions. So the autonomous vehicle it has to be connected. The remote diagnostics, so that the car makers knows what goes wrong inside your car. There's also car-to-car communications with Wi-Fi, so you are able to connect with the car in front of you to know if there's a roadblock or anything. There's virtual keys in your smartphone. You won't have some physical keys anymore. And obviously there are also some Facebook, Pokemon Go, Wi-Fi hotspot, because, well, driver doesn't drive anymore, so you have to keep it occupied, do something while the car is driving. So all this means that the autonomous vehicle doesn't work if it's not connected. How is it autonomous anymore? It's maybe the poorest choice of word here. It's the vehicle itself is not autonomous at all. You know, it heavily depends on the network. If you cut the network, not autonomous anymore. Many things won't work anymore. Driving may be a little bit autonomous, but the vehicle itself, it heavily depends on the network. Very poorly chosen word. And there's also a bit of a problem in the trust model. Here you have many different actors in the ecosystem. You have the drivers, the car manufacturers, car suppliers, infrastructure providers, software developers, governments, local authorities, service providers. You have regulations like ISO, SAE. There's also us, the hackers. All those ecosystems have to work together and make a product that the driver can trust with his life. So that's the end. The objective here is that I, as a driver, do I trust all those ecosystems to make it safe? And it's a real problem because no one knows exactly where the functions are exactly. In the autonomous vehicle, the car will talk to the infrastructure, for example. Who is responsible for the security of this? Is it the infrastructure itself? Is it the car maker? Who do I trust? So all this is already broken here. Do you trust the Chinese supplier here of your ECU for all the software that is built into the ECU? Well, why not trust this when you are not able to assess the security of the infrastructure that is run by your local authority, for example? Those are all problems that are going to arise in the next couple of years. So when we come to the challenges of the not so far future in the next couple of years, maybe the autonomous car is maybe the greatest challenge of all. Because when you think about other domains, energy, industrial systems, airplane, space, the policy, the actual security policy can be very simple. If it's critical, you air gap it. You don't connect it to anything that can be exposed. Air gap. Simple policy. You cannot do this with autonomous vehicles. Because we just saw that it has to be connected to provide the features that we expect as a consumer device. So all this does mean that the challenges that are really that we expect from the autonomous vehicle will be one of the greatest challenges of the next, let's say, 4 years. So we have very little. There's more and more people interested into car hacking. Today we have at least 2 talks, but it's a widely unexplored area right now. So we really need some more people digging into the security of this whole domain, because it will go. We will have some autonomous vehicles. It will happen. It's not a question of whether it will happen, but just when. Okay, so I'm going to stop here because it's only 5 minutes, so I want to take some questions. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Well, if there's no questions, then...
There's one.
Oh, there's one?
There.
Well, I don't think we have any time for questions, right?
Do we?
Okay, we'll take one.
One? Okay.
Well, if this is the only one, let's make it count then. So in terms of you're talking about the autonomous vehicle.
Yes.
But what is the role of governments in this? Because if you think like security researchers are going to find the problems and all those type of things, but it takes a compelling event for things actually to change. So the first time that there's a real accident or a real death around this, and we're kind of seeing that happening in the US, then there's legislation that's going to bring this trust model. It's going to bring a different spin on it. So do you see that changing the landscape when regulation steps in? So think of the seat belt in a car. They never used to have those until there was lots of car crashes, and then they said, okay, now you have to put this in. So do you think regulation's also going to drive this field even further?
Yeah, so obviously the regulations are going to change the landscape. It's obvious it will happen because they won't make it perfect at the first time. So what is really hard to say is that every car maker will have its own implementation of the autonomous system, and their authorities will say, okay, they have to meet certain requirements. But what kind of requirements? And if the car maker has a better one, but it's not compatible with the requirements, will it have to downgrade his own algorithms to meet the government requirements? The regulations will be very hard to define for autonomous vehicles, because it will be, okay, in this situation, when visibility is 10 meters, you have to take, I don't know, the position of stopping the car on the side road, for example. But what if anything else happens at the same time and it has to choose? Maybe some of the car makers will have better algorithms than others, and how is the regulation going to answer some of those questions? It's a really hard question to answer this right now. Yeah? Any other? No? Thank you.
Well, thank you.